Loughton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If I've come in at the end of this bill, having been in on the beginning of it at the second reading, but I too want to pay tribute to the hard work that's gone into this bill, and perhaps crave your indulgence a little in just talking about something that didn't eventually make it to the bill. But can I first say how, yet again, it was interesting. It's children's bills, and having had experience of them over the last 15 or so years, children's bills have a propensity to be hijacked by things that are not in the children's bills at the second reading, that then become the headline at the last stages of such piece of legislation. And true to form, again, this has happened but with the subject of sex and relationship education, which I fully support and added my name to that amendment, and then child refugees, which I also supported but didn't quite make it in the form that some of us had hoped. And that, in many respects, is a shame, because it takes away the attention and the focus from the really important meat that is about the everyday experiences of vulnerable children, and particularly children who find themselves, through no fault of their own, in the care system, for whom this government and successive governments have strived to do so much and have achieved much, but still need to achieve so much more. And so, in welcoming the bill, I would just draw the House's attention again to the fact there's some really good things in this bill that we didn't have much time to discuss and debate today, but are perhaps the more important parts of the bill as it went through its various stages. I, too, absolutely welcome the addition for the sex and relationship education clause. As my right honourable friend from Basingstoke says, this is groundbreaking. Some of us have banged our heads against brick walls in various shadow ministerial and post-ministerial positions over many, many years, and the need for it is so screamingly obvious, and yet, for all sorts of reasons I have never quite understood, it fails to make it into legislation. And the threats to our children, increasingly online, and shockingly being lured into so many things that we would never have been confronted with in our teenage years, just a few years ago in your case, of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, and Madam Deputy Speaker, slightly longer for others, but which on a daily basis are exposed to those threats. And the best way of giving them the defences against them must surely be, at an early age at school, to educate, inform, warn and support them against some of the hazards out in the wider world and the wider web. And I just give one example of something which I found really shocking. A few years ago now, there was a piece on, I think it was Woman's Hour, and it was a case of a teenage girl who was interviewed. She'd been in a relationship with another teenage boy, both, I think, under the age of 16. And he had forced her to watch violent pornographic videos and forced her to act out what they'd seen in those videos. And she had gone along with it, which was quite shocking at that young age, that she was under pressure to do that, and that was deemed to be common practice. But what was really alarming is when the interviewer said to her, "Why on earth didn't you tell him to get lost and report it?" And her response was, "Well, I didn't think I had the right to." Now, if sex and relationship education is anything, it's about giving confidence and empowering young people, and in particular young women, that theirs is the choice to say yes or no, and theirs alone. And so if we can, by developing what is now becoming part of this bill into an empowerment exercise for our young people, so that people should respect other young people and they have the confidence to be able to know and say no when no means no, then I think we will have done our generation of children and future generations a huge service. So I think that is a major step forward that we've taken in this bill, albeit it was never intended when it came for second reading, but fortunately it made it at the last moment, which is excellent, with wide cross-party consensus. And I do hope that the House of Lords, who are forming a bit of a habit for disagreeing with us at the moment, in this case absolutely don't disagree with us, but I would urge ministers that when formulating the very important guidance that will need to go with this legislation, that there is sensitivities, because this is a big move for many people, and it will need to be handled carefully and cautiously. There are many other good things in this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. The local offer for care leavers, and still the figures which we've had at numerous times during the debate on this bill about the poor outcomes for children in care going on to the poor outcomes for care leavers, be it the very small proportion of them who make it on to university, we've still a long way to go. The educational achievement of children in care is still such a large gap, although that gap has narrowed a little, but we need to go so much further. And the preference that the government has given children in care and adopted children through the pupil premium and other measures are a small part of trying to level up that playing field. I welcome the measures, although some of them are a little more controversial than others, on social worker regulation and the need for continuous professional development. But the problem remains that we still have a shortage, and a growing shortage, of experienced child protection social workers. And work that the All-Party Children's Group has done in a study I'll allude to in a minute shows huge divergences in experiences in different local authorities. And at its worst, one local authority which has a 57% locum rate of child social workers. How on earth can we get continuity of care and empathy of care with deeply traumatised and vulnerable children when we have social workers who are not permanently in place to be looking after those children? That is a huge challenge that we still have a large job of work to deal with. On the refugee amendments which we've discussed, which didn't make it into the bill, I do hope that the spirit of that amendment, which had great support on all sides of the House, but where many undertakings have been given by ministers, I do hope that as we go forward, the spirit of that amendment will not be forgotten in it being turned into practice. And if I can finish on those clauses which are no longer in the bill, clauses 32 to 39, the so-called powers to test different ways of working. And I want to congratulate the government, because this is a good example of government listening to people from across various different professions, academics, practitioners, politicians, children's charities and others, including myself, who were seriously concerned about the huge principles at stake if these clauses had gone through. Because there are no parallels for allowing a local authority, or indeed other agencies, to step outside of primary or secondary legislation, effectively at the whim of the Secretary of State of the day. It's not been tried with adults. There are no examples of parallels within the Care Act, the Mental Health Act, the Mental Capacity Act, or whatever. So why on earth were you risking using vulnerable children as guinea pigs to experiment with a new model of working? Now, Madam Speaker, I'm all in favour of innovation. I'm all in favour of being creative in how we can get better outcomes and better support from children who most need it, particularly in the care system. But I just don't think you need to remove primary and secondary legislation built up since 1933 on a whim, without consultation, with whatever safeguards we were promised. At the end of the day, it would mean a postcode lottery for the rights of children and responsibilities towards those children by different local authorities, depending on when those children actually happen to be. Back in 2010, one of the first things the then coalition government did in the Department for Education was to recruit Professor Eileen Munro, to appoint her to head a review of the complete overhaul of child protection social work. And I was very pleased and proud to be part of that in appointing her, and then to implement the recommendations which she came up with. We reduced social work legislation from something like 760 pages in the Working Together manual, which had accrued over years and years and years, where the solution to better child protection was more legislation. Well, what happened in the end is that got in the way of social workers being able to use their professionalism and their instincts and their training to do what was the right thing by the child. Instead, they had constantly to look at the rule book and over their shoulders. So it was right that we reduced that rulebook and that manual and gave greater freedoms and flexibilities to social workers. But at no point did it require, or was it required of us, that we removed the duties, the safety net of primary and secondary legislation. Professor Munro never asked for it, we never considered it, it was never done. So it was absolutely inappropriate, it should be done now, and it was therefore completely appropriate that Professor Ali Munro did not give her support in the end to these changes. So I am pleased that the government have listened, and I'm grateful to the input in putting that message across to ministers from Lord Laming in the other place, Lord Mackay, and my old friend, the member for Rochester and Chatham here today. And what this bill has got to address, Madam Deputy Speaker, in terms of vulnerable children, is huge variation in practice and outcomes for vulnerable children in care up and down the country. The All-Party Group is about to produce its report on the state of children's social care. The average rate of referrals to children's services last year was 532 per 10,000 children in the local population. But the difference between local authorities was the lowest was 187 and the highest was 753 children per 10,000. That's a difference of 9 times, just depending on where that child happened to be. The average national rate of children becoming subject to child protection plans last year was 54 per 10,000, but the difference was the lowest at 16.5 and the highest at 180.5, a difference of 10 times. And our report highlights huge differences in experiences and outcomes for children in care, depending on what local authority they happen to live in. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the biggest challenge we have, because we owe the same duty of care and responsibility to a vulnerable child in care, regardless of whether he or she lives in Yorkshire, in Sussex or in Cornwall. And my fear and our fear with those clauses which are now no longer in the bill is that they would have just widened those differential experiences. And the government's priority absolutely now must be to narrow those gaps to make sure we're doing a better job, and an increasingly better job, for every child in care in every part of the country. So in closing, can I just say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome this bill. I welcome the fact the government have listened. I welcome the fact that debate has contributed to great strengthening of some of the measures in this bill and additional ones. But at the end of the day, we owe our thanks and our respect and our regard to those social workers on the front line doing an exceedingly challenging job in very challenging circumstances, dealing often with very challenged children and families. We owe a duty of care and thanks and respect to the many foster carers and increasingly adoptive parents coming forward to give those children a second chance of a safe, stable and loving home. If there is one upside from our debate over refugees and the publicity over refugees, is that more people have actually come forward to offer themselves as foster carers and adoptive carers, both for refugee children coming to the country, but also for the indigenous children, for whom we still have a large shortage of places in foster care and for adoption. Those are the people who make the difference to children's lives on that front line. We have a lot more to do. We owe a lot greater care to our vulnerable children, but this bill is a very good step in making that achievable.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable